Hi everyone. Today's case takes us back to 4th of July weekend, 1966, where three friends from the Chicago area hopped into a car and drove 60 miles east to Indiana Dunes State Park in Porter County, Indiana. The plan was for them to enjoy some of the weekend festivities at the crowded park along the shores of Lake Michigan. They planned to sunbathe and just catch up. They had plans to be back home in early evening so that the married friend of the bunch would be home in time to prepare dinner for her husband. But they would never make it back to their vehicle that day. The story of what happened to these three young women has speculation that runs the gamut, from a possible botched abortion, a boat kidnapping, organized crime, a secret affair with deadly consequences, a horse-betting criminal underworld, or a tragic boating accident. And saying those really just scratches the surface. In fact, we don't even have time to go through all of the possibilities in one episode. The fate of these three women remains a mystery to this day, one that their aging, surviving relatives seek answers to after nearly 60 years without them. This is A Simpler Time True Crime, the disappearance of Renee Bruhl, Patricia Blough, and Dan Miller. Saturday, July 2nd, 1966. The sun is shining and festivities for the long holiday weekend are underway, and three good friends from the Chicago area are about to set out for theirs. Renee Bruhl, Ann Miller, and Patricia Blough all met as teens, though the string that connects them is Patricia Blough. See, 19-year-old Patricia, who went by Patty, met Ann over their love of horses and boarding their horses at the same stables. Renee, who was also 19, and Patty went to high school together. Patty connected them, and they all began to hang out socially. On this day, 21-year-old Ann left her home on Rockdale Circle in York Township, Illinois, to drive the 7 miles east to pick up Patty on Drury Lane in Westchester. She was driving her 1955 four-door Buick with license plates 265487. They then continued east another 10 miles to pick up Renee on West Fulton Street on the west side of Chicago. Renee spoke to her mom on the phone that morning. She told her mom about the plans she had with her friends and let her know they planned to be gone for the day but be home early that evening. Renee was the married friend of the bunch. She and her husband Jeff had been married for 15 months, and she wanted to be home in time to prepare dinner for him. Before leaving the area, the young women stopped at a drugstore. They picked up a bottle of suntan lotion for $1.53. I can imagine their excitement. To me, I love the little errands of making sure you have everything needed for a perfect beach day. Just to sit there with your cooler and towel, snacks, sunshine. It's just the best. From Renee's house, it was about a 45-minute drive on I-90 to get to Indiana Dunes Park. Back in 1966, Indiana Dunes was just a state park. In 2019, the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore along Lake Michigan was redesignated as a national park. So nowadays, there are two park systems operating in one area. The state-designated area has over 2,000 acres of swimmable beach, a nature center, and hiking trails. The national park surrounds the state park with an additional 13,000 acres over 15 miles. It's one of the most biodiverse parks in the country, with 1,900 different plant and animal species and everything from marshes, savannas, prairies, dunes, and bogs. But it's safe to say Patty, Renee, and Ann were here for the beach. At around 10 a.m., Ann parked in the main parking lot, and the three women walked 3/4 of a mile to a spot 100 yards away from the water. It was already a scorching 88 degrees that day, and the forecast predicted it would creep well into the 90s by midday. They found a patch of shade under a cottonwood tree and took the clothes they had been wearing over their swimsuits off. The park was slammed. According to a 1987 article by Edward Bowman and John O'Brien in the Chicago Times, which I'll be referencing a lot in this episode, there were 8,700 people at the park that day and over 2,100 vehicles. Each of the women wore a bathing suit that matched their own personal style. Anne, who stood 5'2" and had brown hair and blue eyes, was wearing a blue two-piece bathing suit with a red belt. At 5'4", Patty had brown hair and brown eyes and chose a yellow ruffled bikini. Renee was the tallest of the group. She was 5'9" and had brown hair and hazel eyes. She wore a brown swimsuit with a pattern of green flowers and gold leaves, a 1960s pattern and color scheme I've certainly seen before. Sitting nearby was a couple from Chicago, a man named Mike and his girlfriend Frances. At around noon, they noticed the trio wading into the water and talking to a man on a boat. Even though there were tons of people there that day, this stood out to the couple because the women left all of their belongings out in the open and they felt like it was kind of a risky idea. So much so that they sort of informally started keeping an eye on their stuff after they watched the women board this boat. As they spent the day there, they kept waiting for the three women to return. But as Mike and Frances went to leave the park at nightfall, these women still hadn't come back for their things. The couple decided to flag down a park ranger named Bud Connor. They told the ranger that the three women had left behind all their stuff and boarded a boat. Bud asked the couple to describe the boat. They said it was white with blue and an outboard motor, small, only about 14 to 16 feet long. The ranger thanked the couple for their information and said he'd take it from here. Bud was not concerned. It was a regular occurrence for young men to pull up near the shore on their boats and try to get women to join them for a day of partying on the water. He assumed these women would just be glad that the park rangers had held on to their belongings in the park office and that nobody had made off with their stuff, especially with everything they had left behind. Patty left behind a yellow robe, her sunglasses, a transistor radio, her white towel, and her wallet, which contained $5. Anne left her thermos water bottle, denim shorts, shoes, a polo shirt, white bathing cap, and a comb. Renee left her large towel, shorts, blouse, cigarettes, suntan lotion, and her purse, which contained 25 cents and $55 in checks. The park rangers put these items in Lost and Found and didn't think too much of it. That is, until they got a phone call first thing Monday morning from Harold Blough. He was extremely concerned. He shared with the ranger that his daughter Patty had gone to the park with two friends on Saturday, but was supposed to be home that same night. At first, I think he thought she may have just had a change of plans, so that first night he didn't worry too much and just thought she stayed over somewhere. But when she hadn't come home by the following evening, he called around and found that none of the women had been home. It was at that point they realized that the last place they had all been together was the park on Saturday. The park ranger superintendent who took the phone call was William Svedick. He had been there Saturday when Bud Connor had brought the belongings in, and he sensed there could be a connection. As he scoured the belongings, amongst them he found a keychain that had a miniature Illinois license plate on it that read 265287. He asked his men to go search the parking lot to see if there were any vehicles there that had that plate. Lo and behold, there in the parking lot was a vehicle that matched the key ring. At 8:50 that Monday morning of July 4th, Svedick phoned state police. According to that same article in the Chicago Tribune, at 10 a.m., Trooper Harry Young collected the personal possessions left behind and called police in Chicago to run the plates. 20 minutes later, Young was notified that the plates were registered to Ann Miller of Westchester and that a missing persons report had been filed the night prior for her and her two friends by family members. First Sergeant Edward Burke reported to the scene. He went through the belongings at the car. There were items of clothing left behind in the car and a few other miscellaneous items, but nothing too surprising. Not finding any evidence that the women were in the park still, he contacted the Coast Guard to request a search of the southern end of Lake Michigan. They sprung into action but advised Burke to keep his expectations in check. They were dealing with a needle in a haystack scenario with the boat. There were 5,000 to 6,000 boats between the area of the park and Chicago on the sunny Saturday that this took place. On Tuesday morning, Burke coordinated with park rangers, police, and military volunteers to do a ground search of the park across the various topography, on foot and by horseback. Nothing notable was found. As nightfall came, he ordered a beach buggy to spend the night going up and down the shoreline. Sadly, if the women had drowned on Saturday, this would be the timeline that their bodies would surface and float to shore. But night turned into daybreak again, and no signs of the women turned up. On that day, 2 phone calls came in from witnesses that seemed to corroborate each other and breathe new life into the search. One was from an Indianapolis couple, and the other was from 2 men in Illinois. They described the same scene as the initial couple about seeing 3 women enter the boat. But they also were able to give some additional information, notably that the boat was heading west. Also, they had a description of the man on the boat. They said he was well tanned, in his early 20s, with dark wavy hair, and was wearing a beach jacket. The callers had described swimsuits that matched the ones the women were wearing, and they had positively identified the women from pictures. This concentrated the search to Ogden Dunes, a wealthy neighborhood west of the park with large homes and wooded landscapes. But this also didn't turn up any evidence of the women or what happened to them. Volunteers continued to band together and had reached over 100 people at this point, not including all of the paid people who were being paid as police officers to do the search. By Wednesday afternoon, the investigation pivoted with the discovery of pieces of a wrecked boat. This was around the now decommissioned Bailey Generating Station of the Northern Indiana Public Service Company, about 4 miles west of the park. There was a water intake crib a quarter of a mile out into the lake around the station, and the Coast Guard theorized that a boat could have smashed into it and fragmented. What they found was just debris, though. Pieces of metal and styrofoam believed to be parts of 3 boat seats, as well as oil and gasoline cans and oil-soaked wood. Interestingly, though, no boat was ever reported missing. Those working on the case could not say if this was at all connected to the disappearances of the women. There was just too little information. By Thursday, July 7th, the exhaustive search continued. Civil Air Patrol planes searched from above all over, as far north as New Buffalo, Michigan, which is over 11 miles for reference. The Coast Guard was checking every boat along Lake Michigan in Illinois, Indiana, and southern Michigan. This would continue on without a break for a week. According to that same article in the Tribune, the Coast Guard dispatched 10 cutters, which I looked up, and those are defined as Coast Guard vessels 65 feet or greater in length. So these are really big boats going out to search. In addition, they dispatched 1 airplane and 1 helicopter. Meanwhile, the Civil Air Patrol had a minimum of 4 airplanes at any given time searching, and 2 Army helicopters were in the search as well. Scuba divers searched the lake bottom. The manpower in this search was just unmatched, especially for the time. People were really coordinating to try to find answers for these families and try to bring these women home. And there was nothing territorial or jurisdictional about this search. Burke was even asking for civilian help. He asked anyone with bloodhounds to bring their dogs to the search, and he asked cabin owners along the shoreline to search their properties. It was worth the risk of, possibly muddying up an investigation, bringing in civilians, because the risk of having it go on longer and having evidence washed away and having less of a chance of getting answers, it just outweighed it to take the risk of bringing in civilians. Officers continued to interview people going door to door to these cabins that were along the lake, and if the cabins were vacant, they peered through the windows just to see if they spotted anything. With days of searching under their belts and not anything to show for it, investigators did believe with quite a bit of confidence that the boat ride held the key to the disappearance. While it was possible that the women went swimming and could have drowned, it was highly unlikely. Patty and Renee were incredibly strong swimmers, and Anne could hold her own. It was reported that Patty was capable of swimming 20 to 30 miles. I don't know who told investigators that and exactly how they learned it. That seems like excessive to me. But either way, it does make it seem like the drowning possibility is minimal, especially all three of them. I could see one of them having some sort of drowning accident, but all three without any witnesses, it just doesn't seem like the answer. The families of the women were not aware of anybody they knew who owned a boat and said the women weren't particularly into boating or being out on the water. Calls from witnesses ranged all over the place, as usual in investigations. One drugstore owner swore he saw one of the women several days after their disappearances buying magazines. But, as we know, sometimes that's just how it goes, and it was likely just a look-alike. I've mentioned in other episodes how with eyewitness statements and composite sketches and victim pictures being circulated, your brain can kind of play tricks on you. So that's possibly the case here. And as we sometimes find out, these supposed eyewitnesses just seem to really like attention, and they didn't actually witness anything at all. Some people who were at the park that day said that they saw the women get on a boat with 3 men. Some said 2 men, and others say it was just 1 man. Now, obviously, we've all seen cases where eyewitness testimony has been known to break a case wide open. For example, someone may have seen something that they didn't realize was substantial at the time, and when they come forward, it breaks a case wide open. But also, these variances just showcase the unreliability of eyewitness testimony as well. With memories fading or adjusting over time, you just can't always get an exact answer. On Thursday evening, the Coast Guardsmen patrolling interviewed 3 Michigan City men who admitted that they had attempted to pick up 3 women who matched the description of Renee, Anne, and Patricia on Saturday. The men said that the women were standing in chin-deep water and turned them down, with one of them saying, "Sorry, I can't, I'm married." This once again made the searchers consider drowning, and an exhaustive underwater search of the area took place, with nothing to show for it. One thing I'm curious about, though, is the comment on the water height. Remember, the 3 women are 5'2", 5'4", and 5'9", and so it's not all going to be the same level on all of them. So that was just confusing and a little side note for me. Searchers refused to give up hope. They distributed thousands of flyers throughout the park. Patty's father, Harold, was a lieutenant colonel of the Illinois Civil Air Patrol, and he carried on a personal search himself for the girls. He and others pored over wilderness and lake homes, taking photographs that they'd later develop and painstakingly look over photo by photo, looking for any clues to their whereabouts, good or bad. A beachgoer came forward to say that he had been there on July 2nd and that he was filming home movies with lots of panning shots of the water. He made his reels available to authorities who used them to narrow down to 2 boats once they viewed the footage. Who knew that in 1966, some form of technology was going to play a role in this case? According to the Charlie Project website, one was a fiberglass, 16 to 18 foot long trimaran runabout with a 3-hull design, which was operated by a man fitting the description of the unidentified driver. 3 females matching the missing women were seen aboard the smaller boat in the footage. The second boat identified was a 26 to 28 foot long Trojan cabin cruiser with 3 men aboard along with 3 women. The cabin cruiser was seen at approximately 3 o'clock p.m., 3 hours after the women entered the smaller vessel. Investigators believe that the women may have been dropped off on the beach by the driver of the smaller boat, while he drove back to retrieve 2 male friends and the cabin cruiser. Patty, Ann, and Renee were reportedly seen eating and walking along the sand dunes after this time. This could never be completely verified, this particular sighting, but authorities feel it's credible. At this point, there were several people who felt the women left voluntarily. This included investigator Burke as well as Renee Bruhl's own father. His theory was that the girls had taken off and were too scared to come home after seeing the press coverage they had garnered. But Harold Blough did not share in their sentiment. He said, quote, "In my heart, I feel this was an abduction. My daughter is a regular reader of the newspapers. If she were free to move, she would have read newspaper accounts of the search for her and her friends, and she would have come home. If she were running away, she would have taken more clothing and her contact lenses, her cosmetic case, and her keys to her car. Besides, she was completely wrapped up in her horse. She would have not run out on Hank." End quote. So now that we've introduced Patty's horse Hank, we need to dive into a bigger part of this story and a huge possible theory. All 3 women were into horses. I mentioned earlier that Ann and Patty had met at the stables. Hank was Patty's thoroughbred horse. Before acquiring him, she owned a saddle horse and kept him at the same stable as Ann. Ann had been employed at the Oak Brook Polo Club, where she exercised the horses. At this time in 1966, all 3 women were regular riders at Tricolor Stables in Palatine, Illinois. This was owned by George Jane, a prominent horse dealer who was wrapped up in the dark underbelly of the horse betting, dealing, and racing world. I won't lie, I've never been a big horse person. I feel like you either are or you aren't, and I grew up with lots of horse girls, and I thought they were super cool. I just wasn't one of them, so I'm sorry if I get any of the terminology wrong or sort of misstep and stumble over the horse world, but I'll do my best. Here is what I do know. George and his brother, Silas Jane, were in a bitter feud over horse dealings in the mid-60s, and it had turned deadly. In June of 1965, George's friend, Cheryl Ann Rood, was at Tricolor Stables. She had also been involved in the horse market. In fact, she used to be part of Silas's stables and then came over to be with George. George had handed Cheryl his keys and asked her to move his Cadillac away from the stable doors. When she did so, a car bomb exploded, killing her instantly. It was clear that the bomb was intended for George and that Cheryl was the unfortunate collateral. Silas Jane, who was born in 1907, was not a good dude. He had 2 brothers, DeForest and Frank, and George, who I mentioned already, was his half-brother. They were all skilled trainers and riders and owned several stables in the Chicago area. In the 30s, Silas opened 2 riding academies. He ran the Elston Riding Academy in Chicago with his brothers, and each year they hosted an annual rodeo and horse show featuring Jane, his brothers, and his students. By 1933, Silas's brother Frank Jane began a livestock hauling and trading business in Woodstock. The Jane brothers would ship feral horses from the western United States by railroad to Woodstock. The best of those horses were trained, and the ones who didn't make the cut were slaughtered for dog food. By 1936, George Jane began holding annual horse shows at his Sportsman's Riding Stables in Morton Grove, Illinois. DeForest Jane won trophy after trophy for his horsemanship. This power family continued to amass wealth and business contracts, dominating the horse industry in Illinois. But it was not all sunshine and rainbows, and they were not on the up and up. Silas was the ringleader and had a reputation for being a bully, and calling him a bully is putting it nicely. He used to tell competition that he served time for murder as an attempt to intimidate them. In one race, Silas and his brothers beat a rider who had been winning so severely until he could no longer compete. Silas also had a different evil side to him. He would find wealthy men and sell them worthless horses to the men and their early teenage daughters. He would claim they were going to be the next winning horses. These young girls would then spend hours upon hours at the stables unsupervised with Silas and his colleagues. Silas bragged to others that he would molest these girls. When the fathers would ask about the poor quality and performances of the horses, Silas would then tell the fathers that his staff at the stables reported their daughters were promiscuous, and because most of these fathers were in the higher side of society, the scandal-worthiness of this would make it so that the fathers would no longer push the issue. So yeah, pretty gross. Silas was thought to have gotten away with a lot of crimes because of having ins with the Chicago Police Department and his ties to the mafia. Silas was not part of the Chicago outfit at this time, which is the massive family of the Italian-American mafia operating in Chicago's South Side during this time. However, his idle hour stables were patronized by prominent mobster Mad Sam DiStefano and other associates. Allegedly, these men played cowboys, where they'd ride horses and shoot their guns into the air. The Jane brothers started to fragment in alliances in the 1950s, though. Silas wanted his brother George to purchase his Green Tree stables, but George's sportsman riding stables were prospering, and he turned down the opportunity. This did not go over well with Silas. He was not being used to being told no. While spending the winter in Florida and shortly thereafter, George's house on the grounds of sportsman riding stables burned down. It was never proven, but George felt Silas was behind it. 1 month after the fire, I don't know what conversations happened, but George sold his sportsman riding stables and ultimately did purchase Green Tree Stables from Silas, and then he renamed it Happy Days Stables. Silas, likely with this additional money, then moved his idle hour stables to a much larger facility, not far from George's stables. This new stables employed men with ties to the Chicago outfit, notably Curtis and Kenneth Hansen. This is important because Kenneth Hansen was later found guilty of molesting and murdering young boys, some of which occurred at the stables he was employed at under Silas. Kenneth was eventually arrested and spent the rest of his life in prison, but this didn't occur until decades after the murders. In 1959, George Jane moved his Happy Days stables and renamed it to Tricolor Stables near his home in Inverness, Illinois. The competition and bitterness in the horse business between George and Silas was at an all-time high. Prior to the 1965 car bomb of Cheryl Rood, George's office was burglarized. At night, vehicles had attempted to run him off the road. Shots were fired in his office. His tires were punctured and lug nuts were taken off. Sugar was poured into his gas tank. 2 of his horses were poisoned. Dynamite was left at his back door, but the fuse fizzled out. In one particular night in 1963, George was working late in his office and sensed danger, so he left in a borrowed car and left his own vehicle at the office with the lights on in the office to give the impression that he was still there. That evening, 28 shots were fired into his office. And that same year, 2 hitmen came forward admitting they were hired to kill George. So, just pausing here to say this may have been a quote-unquote simpler time, but was it safer? Because this is crazy. When it comes to the 1965 murder of Cheryl Rood, her case actually wasn't fully solved until 1997, when hitmen were eventually convicted in it, and no surprise, the hire came back to Silas Jane. But by this time, he had already died of cancer. Apparently, just as a side note, the Jane family held a family meeting in 1966 where they all came together with different agreements on horse territory and what competitions which brother was allowed to join in, and apparently they just sort of made up, which is bananas. Imagine having your brother riddled with bullets, or at least attempted to, and putting sugar in his gasoline and killing his friend and doing all of these things, and then just having like a good old-fashioned family meeting and deciding you are going to put it behind you. As a spoiler alert, That agreement didn't last, and they didn't put it behind them, and in 1970, George Jane was murdered on his son's 16th birthday while they were celebrating, by shots fired into his home. And of course, it was found out that Silas was behind it. There's actually more murders and crimes that Silas ends up being tied to, but I don't want to get too far into it because I could just do a whole episode on the Jane brothers. And here we just need to focus on their connection to these three women. So now that you have the picture of the organized crime links to the stables that George Jane owned and these three women rode at, let's pick back up there. Authorities found George Jane and Silas Jane's numbers among the women's belongings. They theorized that one or all of the women may have been witness to the bomb that killed Cheryl Rood being planted. In a 2023 NBC interview, Patty's sister Janice recalled Patty acting differently in the days leading up to her disappearance. In fact, just the day before her disappearance, Janice and Patty looked frightened, and she was crying. She said to her sister, quote, "I'm in terrible trouble." According to Janice, Patty was dating a married man at the time. So hearing this, she asked her sister if she was pregnant, and Patty replied that she wished it were that simple. I can't imagine what she was involved in or how scared she must have been if whatever this situation occurring made pregnancy with a married man the simpler of the options. She also allegedly told people in 1966 that she was having issues with, quote, horse syndicate people, which, if you don't know, because I didn't, those are people involved in the investment of horses and owning shares of horses that participate in races. This came up when friends asked her about a bruise on her cheek that looked like it came from a fist. This was approximately 4 months prior to her disappearance. The understanding Patty's sister had of the situation was that Patty had purchased her winning horse Hank for just $1,500. The original owners got angry when the horse started doing all of this great work and winning, and Patty refused to sell the horse back. In fact, the weekend Patty disappeared, Hank won $900 at a race in Winnipeg, but the earnings went uncollected. After the three women went missing, Silas Jane allegedly told a police officer that he had 3 bodies buried underneath his house. The police took this seriously and planned to do a search. But the sheriff who was coordinating the search died in a farming accident just before the search was supposed to take place. And I can't make this up, they just didn't search after that. Nobody picked up the torch and decided to keep it going. They just were like, well, I guess we can't search because this person died and now we don't have a search leader. So I don't even know what to say to that, but that's actually what happened from my understanding. One of Silas Jane's workers had a blue and white motorboat that matched the description of the boat the women were seen boarding. He often took it out to the Indiana Dunes. When police inquired about this boat, they were told it had burned in a fire. So all in all, this is a viable theory that has never been proven or disproven, absent of any evidence to do so. Pivoting back to Patty Blough and her affair with the married man, Ann Miller was also dating a married man, and according to friends, she was 3 months pregnant. So this led to the next lead. One of the men at the park on the day the women vanished was named Ralph Largo Jr. Ralph lived with his aunt and uncle, and he resembled the driver of the boat. His aunt and uncle were apparently performing illegal abortions, and one theory was that he took the women to a larger boat where one or more botched abortions were performed and the other women were killed in a cover-up. This one is not ruled out just because nothing can be ruled out, but it does seem pretty far-fetched. Police indicated they looked into this lead but could find nothing to substantiate it, and that Ralph Largo died in 2009. Frank and Helen Largo's abortion clinic was operated on land, and there's never been any indication of a boat clinic. Also, by all accounts, Miller's friends did not believe she was having an abortion. They said that she planned to go to a home for unwed mothers to seek assistance. When looking in Renee Bruhl's purse, they found a letter she had apparently written but not given to her husband. In it, she describes being unhappy in her marriage. She said her husband spent too much time working on hot rod cars and not enough time with her, and she expresses in the letter that she wants to leave her marriage. Investigators asked Renee's husband about this, but he claimed they didn't have any real marital issues at the time. Her family felt that she wrote it in a moment of anger and probably didn't intend to actually give it to him, possibly even forgetting she still had it. The truth is, only Renee knows the answer to how she felt about her marriage, but the only connection that could have to their disappearance would be if she wanted to run off. But that theory doesn't really make sense. Why would all three of them be in on that? I absolutely could see friends assisting another friend in getting away from an unhappy marriage if that's what it took. But also it seemed like Renee seemed okay with having conversations. She had written out this letter, so it didn't seem like she needed to plan some big escape. And also, why would her friends go with her? In tracing the relationships of the women and their movements leading up to the disappearance, police found a few more interesting things. For one, on the early morning of July 2nd, the same day they disappeared, Anne and Patty had returned to their respective homes just before dawn, meaning that they had just rolled into bed and gotten a couple hours of sleep before heading out to the beach. So did they just have a night of partying, or did something else happen that evening that sort of had a cause and effect? Did this have anything to do with their disappearance? That's one of the things people speculate about, just because that does seem kind of odd. But to me, it doesn't. Sounds like 19 and 21-year-olds just going out for a night of partying. I think a lot of people could look back to those years of their life and remember times they did the exact same thing. Patty Blough also used to date a rodeo cowboy and former convict named John Paul Jones, but he was living in California at the time of the disappearances, and he's not thought to be connected in any way. Police did look into him just because of his criminal history, but it seemed like a far-fetched theory. So, we're left with many scenarios, some much more likely than others. Were one or two of the women pregnant and seeking abortions? Did something go wrong in obtaining these abortions? And the people running the illegal clinic panicked and killed the witnesses? Did the women run away from problems they were having in their personal lives? If this is the case, all three have decided to stay away and completely commit to that plan. Did Silas Jane and his associates lure the women out to a party only to murder them for what they had seen? Were the women aware of more in the organized crime world than we even know about and were silenced for that? Did they get lured onto a boat by a complete stranger whose name has not come up whatsoever and who ultimately decided to harm them? What about those men who claimed they tried to get the women to come onto their boat and the women turned them down? Was that a convenient cover story in the event that some witnesses could have identified them? Did they insert themselves into the investigation and feed bad information to throw off authorities? Did the women die in a boating or drowning accident and no part of them or the accident has ever surfaced? Quite possibly, there's a scenario I haven't even covered here today. Renee and Patty would be 77 years old today, and Anne would be 79 if they were still alive. Many of their relatives have passed away without ever knowing their fate. Patty's sister still misses her. She said in that 2023 interview, quote, "She was my big sister and I loved being with her. I loved her dearly," end quote. The investigation into the disappearances of these three women is currently cold and inactive. However, leads will still be investigated. I know it's unlikely that I have any listeners who would have remembered something from this time, but maybe you've talked to a relative or heard information passed on. It's never too late to bring answers to those who are seeking them. Anyone with information on the disappearances of Patricia Blough, Renee Bruhl, and Ann Miller is asked to contact the Westchester Police Department at 708-345-0060. This has been a Simpler Time True Crime. Next week, I will not have my regular Monday episode because of a vacation. However, I will have a special episode during the week, so make sure you're subscribed to the podcast wherever you listen so that you know when the episode drops. And as always, if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a review, follow us on social media, and tell your friends. I will be posting all supporting pictures from this episode on our Instagram page @SimplerTimeCrimePod. Thank you so much for listening.